let's get into chapter 7, which is talking about economic growth. So everything we talked about in terms of GDP and GDP per capita, basically now what we're going to do is look at how can countries build their GDP for the long term. So basically when we were looking at the business cycles, okay, and we saw that it was going upward, how can countries make sure we're going up? Even though we're having expansions and contractions, we still want to be going on the upward growth trend. Okay? So, economic growth, in terms of modern terms, is the period of rapid economic growth, basically from 1870 onward. So, if you were to look at GDP from way back then to now, okay, it would just be like a straight line up. Okay? So, rapid sustained economic growth is relatively recent experience for the human race. Like, if you were to look at just, 1800 years, I mean, it was relatively like this. Think of the traditional economy where we had very little economic growth. And then once we started learning about the markets, okay, to where we can build and we can trade, have comparative advantage, things like that, then we're able to have economic growth. And so it'll go like this, and all of a sudden it'll start shooting up, in recent terms. Before the last 2 centuries, the average person's standard of living had not changed much for centuries, right? Remember, this was that traditional economy. But then once we started getting to the Industrial Revolution, where we basically had started making new ways on trying to produce things, okay, there was a widespread of the use of power-driven machines and economic and social changes that resulted in the first half of the 1800s. Okay, so basically we went from humans doing absolutely everything to having the first machines that were able to make production. And as we know with machines, they're just able to do things faster, sometimes better. Okay, and then when you can do that, you can now produce more. GDP will grow. The Industrial Revolution led to increasing inequality among nations too. So basically, you had some countries that had the machines, and you had some countries that didn't. So the countries that did have the machines, economic growth instantly. The countries that did not stayed the same. So we had an instant growth here, and other countries stayed the same. So that's where we had inequality growing among countries. 1870, GDP of the top economies of the world was 2.5 times the GDP per capita of the world's poorest countries. So basically, if you had the poorest country down here and the top country here, okay, there was a distance here of 2.4 times. So basically, if you were to take this lowest GDP, multiply it by 2.4 times, then that would give you the top nation's GDP. But because of the Industrial Revolution, and it continued on from there, now the top economy is 4.2 times the GDP per capita of the poorest economies. So now we have increased that inequality between the top and the bottom. Okay, so it's a great thing if you're living in those countries, but some of those countries are still having more of the traditional type to where they have very little economic growth. Okay, so new jobs were created from the Industrial Revolution, and because of that, they were able to offer higher pays, and with higher pays, you're able to buy more things, and if you need to buy more things, you need to make more stuff, right? See how it's a cycle, and that's how we have economic growth. A self-reinforcing cycle began. Okay, so because you had more income to buy things, you wanted to buy more things. In order to buy more things, you created a new demand for things. And if there's a new demand for it, we need those entrepreneurs to create inventions for it. And with the invention of something, there are profits to be made. So therefore, we have created a cycle. The profits can then be provided for new investment and new inventions, and the investments and inventions provided opportunities for further profits. So basically, when we started the Industrial Revolution of creating, the steam-powered engine, then the ideas started rolling of like, well, what can we use because of that? What could be a substitute? What could be a complement, right? And once we understood those things, okay, we were able to make new inventions and new investments over here. And then we had more people that were like, okay, well, we have this. Okay, well, how can we improve that? How can we make a substitute or a complement to that? And so we had new inventions and new investments there as well. So that really is why we had just dramatic economic growth, because of the Industrial Revolution. Some economies did take off, where others, like many of those in Africa or Asia, remain close to their subsistence standard of living. So again, that traditional economy. However, in the middle of the 20th century, some countries had shown the possibility of catching up. Like China, grew 9% per year from 1984 to 2000s. Now remember, the goal of a macroeconomy was like 3 to 4% growth. So growing at 9%, that new minus old divided by old, growing at 9% is phenomenal. It's crazy number. Okay? Brazil growing on average 11.1% annually from 1968 to 1973. So just dramatic growth on these countries. Okay? So some of them are catching up, for sure. Laws have a big impact on economic growth. So there's going to be two things that are influencing long-run economic growth. One of them being rule of law. So laws do have a place in society in terms of making sure everything is going correctly and we're growing. The process of enacting laws that protect individual and entity rights to use their property the way they see fit. Okay, so basically, if I own something, nobody else can take it because it's mine. Okay, if someone can just take my ideas, then there is no point in me creating ideas. And if I'm not creating ideas, we're not going to have that cycle of new inventions and new investments and more economic growth. So if you can protect me and my ideas, I'd love to give them to you. So that's where laws come into play. And laws must be clear, public, fair, and enforced. They have to be, because we have to make sure that the inventors, the entrepreneurs are protected. Okay, because we really, really need those people. There's also a protection for contractual rights. So basically, if you agree to something, there is a contract that says you agree to it. And if you do not follow through with that contract, there are laws and rules that you must do against that. So the rights of individuals to enter into agreements with others regarding the use of their property. So basically, if I agree to work with my boss, right, then we have an agreement that I will go and do these tasks. I will use their computers, let's say, to complete a task. Okay. Providing recourse through the legal system in the event of non-compliance. So basically, like an employee agreement. Okay. If someone is paying me to complete a task, I must complete it, or I will have to give the money back, or I will have to pay a fine, right? Or there is some sort of consequence to not following through with a contract. And if there's a consequence, then I'm more likely to complete the contract. So contracts, laws, and contract rights are a great way to make sure that things get done in the country. And there's actually a measurement for this. So the World Bank has developed a ranking system for countries' legal systems based on the effective protection of property rights and the rule-based governance using a scale of 1 to 6. So basically 1 is the lowest you can go and 6 is the highest. 6 would be like you have really good protection on property, and your government's doing a great job in making sure that people are following the contracts and following the law. The world average was 2.9. Okay. The 3 lowest were Somalia, so they had a 1.0, and Eritrea. And look at the GDP per capita. I mean, $875 per person, or $1,625 per person. So as you can see here, because of the lower laws and the lower contractual rights here, and the lower governance, we are having a lower GDP. South Sudan was at 1.5, and that had 1,200. Same thing here. Low ranking in terms of legal systems. And sure enough, we had low GDP per capita. Land redistribution and price controls have disrupted the economy, and corruption and violence have dominated the political process. So laws are great in the sense of like making sure that you are protected, but there's also the fraud that goes into the laws, or there might be some political process that just takes forever to get a law in, or there might be violence because of the law. So, that's why it's really important that if there's a law, make sure it's fair and enforced, because then we'll have chaos. And then if there's chaos, we're definitely not going to have economic growth. Despite economic growth increasing, those countries lacking a clear system of property rights and an independent court system free of corruption have lagged far behind in terms of GDP per capita. And you can look at this and you can look at other countries that are having issues with their legal system, or maybe they're having some big issues with fraud. And sure enough, they're having a lower standard of living and they're having a low GDP per capita. Okay, so that is the impact on laws. They're very, very important to make sure you are heading in the right direction. In the next section, we'll talk about labor productivity and how that plays into economic growth. I'll see you there. Bye.